It rises like a fortress, with cliffs hundreds of meters high, guarding an otherworldly landscape. Roraima is the tallest of South America's ancient flat-top mountains in the Canaima National Park.
Venezuela has a secret that's taller than the clouds and older than the stars you see at night. Imagine giant, flat-topped stone blocks punching through the jungle like the stumps of a world tree. They don't look like mountains, they look like a mistake. These are the Tepuis. They are vertical, arrogant, and shouldn't still be standing. While the rest of the world changed, these islands in the sky stayed exactly the same, guarding a logic that humans are only just beginning to crack. The billion-year-old basement. The ground beneath your feet is a liar. Think about that, because these mountains look like they belong on another planet. Most of the Earth is constantly recycling itself. Mountains rise, they crumble, and the tectonic plates melt them back into the belly of the world. But the Guyana Shield, the massive slab of rock that holds up Venezuela, is different. It's stubborn. It's the old man of the planet's crust, and it has been sitting in the same spot for roughly 2 billion years. Think about that number for a second. When this rock was formed, there were no trees. There were no dinosaurs. There wasn't even enough oxygen in the atmosphere for you to take a single breath. The world was a violent, volcanic mess of cooling soup, and right in the middle of it, this giant basement of sandstone and quartzite began to settle. It's called the Roraima Supergroup, and it's effectively the Earth's original foundation. If the Earth is a house, the Tepuis are the original floorboards that stayed put while the rest of the building was renovated 1,000 times. What makes these mountains a mystery isn't just their age, though, it's their shape. Most mountains are formed by collisions, two plates smashing together like cars in a slow-motion wreck, pushing the Earth upward into jagged peaks. That's how the Himalayas happened. That's how the Andes happened. But the Tepuis didn't rise. The rest of the world just fell away around them. Imagine a massive, flat birthday cake sitting on a table. Now, imagine a very hungry kid comes along and eats everything except for a few perfectly square pillars of cake in the middle. That's what happened here. For hundreds of millions of years, water, wind, and heat acted like a slow-motion chisel. They ate away at the softer cracks in the Earth, washing trillions of tons of sediment into the Atlantic Ocean. But the quartzite that makes up the Tepuis is a different beast. Quartzite is basically sand that has been squeezed so hard by the weight of time that it turned into something as tough as steel. It doesn't just erode, it fights back. While the surrounding landscape turned into low-lying jungles and river basins, these pillars stood their ground. They became islands in the sky, disconnected from the world below by vertical cliffs that dropped 3,000 feet straight down. This isolation is why they defy logic. When you stand at the base of a mountain like Mount Roraima, you aren't looking at a peak. You're looking at a remnant of a prehistoric plateau that once covered the entire northern half of South America. It's a ghost of a world that no longer exists. Because they are so old and so isolated, the physics of the summits started to do weird things. Usually, a mountaintop is a lonely, cold place where nothing stays put. But because the Tepuis are flat, they trapped their own ecosystems. They became evolutionary lifeboats. They didn't just survive the passage of time, they opted out of it entirely. The mystery isn't just that they are still there, it's that they managed to stay so perfect. There are no jagged edges here, only sharp 90-degree angles that look like they were cut by a giant's laser. Scientists used to look at these and think they were impossible. How could something so tall and so top-heavy survive 2 billion years of tropical storms and tectonic shifts without tipping over or crumbling into a pile of gravel? The answer lies in the chemistry of the stone itself. The quartzite is so pure and so tightly packed that water can't get inside it to freeze and crack it. It's like a natural fortress. It is a geological miracle of survival, a piece of the deep past that refused to be erased. Time didn't just pass here. It stood still and watched. The logic differs. Physics versus quartzite. If you tried to build a Tepuis today, physics would probably laugh in your face. These mountains are top-heavy, sheer-sided, and look like they were dropped onto the jungle floor by a giant who didn't care about the rules of gravity. Most mountains are shaped like pyramids, wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. It's a stable, sensible shape. But a tepuis is essentially a massive, heavy table with no legs. It's a geological middle finger to everything we know about how terrain is supposed to age. The primary mystery that kept geologists scratching their heads for decades was a simple question. Why haven't they fallen over? When you look at a cliff face like the one on Mount Roraima, you aren't looking at a slope. You are looking at a vertical wall of rock that rises nearly 3,000 feet straight into the air. In any other part of the world, a wall like that would have been chewed up by the weather millions of years ago. Water gets into cracks, it freezes, it expands, and pop, the rock shatters. But in the tropical heat of Venezuela, there is no ice. Instead, there is relentless, pounding rain, the kind of rain that turns solid ground into mud in seconds. You'd think this water would dissolve the mountains, and it tries. But the tepuis are made of a very specific kind of stubbornness called Precambrian quartzite. This isn't just regular rock, it's sand that has been cooked and crushed under such intense pressure that it's almost glass. It's incredibly hard, and, more importantly, it's chemically bored. It doesn't want to react with anything. Most rocks have minerals that dissolve in rainwater, but quartzite just sits there and lets the water slide off its back like a duck. However, the logic-defying part gets even weirder when you look at the summits. Because they are flat, you'd expect them to be covered in deep soil and thick forests after 2 billion years. But they aren't. They are barren, blackened, and alien. The rain is so constant and so heavy that it washes away every single speck of dirt before it can even settle. This creates a paradox. You have a mountain that is technically dying because it's being washed away, yet it looks brand new. The black coating on the rocks isn't soot or age. It's a layer of microscopic algae that has figured out how to live on bare stone. Underneath that black skin, the rock is a bright, startling pink. It's like the mountain is a living organism that keeps shedding its skin to stay young. Then there's the wind. On top of a tepuis, the wind doesn't just blow, it carves. Over millions of years, the wind has sculpted the surface of the summits into stone cities. These are fields of bizarre, twisted rock towers that look like melted wax or distorted gargoyles. They follow no logical pattern. In some places, you'll find a balancing rock, a boulder the size of a house sitting on a pedestal the size of a dinner plate. By all accounts, it should have tipped over during the last thunderstorm, but it stays. Scientists call this static equilibrium, which is just a fancy way of saying the rock is so heavy and the base is so strong that even a hurricane can't budge it. But to the naked eye, it looks like magic. It looks like the mountain is holding its breath, waiting for a single gust of wind to finally end the streak. The real defiance of logic, though, is the water. Because there is no soil to soak up the rain, the water has to go somewhere. It forms a massive, temporary rivers that race across the flat stone tops, and then simply vanish. They fall off the edge in some of the highest waterfalls on the planet, including Angel Falls. Think about the energy required to keep a 3,000-foot waterfall running for thousands of years. It should have carved a massive canyon into the side of the mountain by now. It should have sliced the tepuis in half. But the quartzite is so tough that the water barely leaves a scratch. The mountain is winning a war of attrition against the very elements that created it. We are used to a world that changes. We see hills erode and rivers shift their banks. We see mountains crumble. But the tepuis defy that narrative. They are the same today as they were when the first multi-celled organisms crawled out of the sea. They aren't just mountains, they are stone monuments to the idea that if you are tough enough, you don't have to change for anyone. Gravity is more of a suggestion than a law. Evolution's secret lab. If you managed to scale those 3,000-foot vertical walls, you wouldn't just be stepping onto a mountaintop. You'd be stepping onto a different timeline. Because the summits of the tepuis are so isolated, they act like biological islands. They are cut off from the jungle floor by a sea of air and stone. For millions of years, the animals and plants up here have been playing a game of telephone with evolution, and the message has gotten very, very weird. In the rest of the world, species have to compete. If a new predator shows up, you either run faster, hide better, or go extinct. But on top of a tepuis, there's nowhere to run and nowhere for new competitors to come from. It's a closed loop. This has created what scientists call high levels of endemism. That's a fancy way of saying that about 35% of the life on these summits exists nowhere else on the entire planet. Not in the next valley, not in the next country, nowhere. Take the pebble toad, for example. It's a tiny, charcoal-colored creature that looks like a piece of the very rock it sits on. Most toads hop or swim to escape a predator. But the pebble toad lives on a flat stone world where there are no ponds to dive into and no soft dirt to burrow under. So, it did something brilliant and bizarre. When a tarantula or a bird comes near, the toad doesn't hop. It tenses its muscles, pulls in its limbs, and turns itself into a literal ball. Then, it just lets go. It bounces down the rocks like a rubber marble, tumbling into a crevice where the predator can't reach it. It's a logic-defying survival tactic that only makes sense if you live on a giant stone table. It's evolution's version of a get-out-of-jail-free card. Then there are the plants. Remember, there's almost no soil on the summits. The rain washes everything away. In a normal forest, plants get their nutrients from the ground. On a tepuis, the ground is basically a sterile dinner plate, so the plants had to become hunters. You'll find vast fields of heliamphora, the sun pitcher plants. They look like elegant, translucent trumpets reaching out of the mist. They don't just sit there and look pretty. They lure insects into their slippery maws. The bugs fall in, drown in a pool of rainwater and digestive enzymes, and the plant eats them to get the nitrogen it can't find in the rock. Even weirder is the drosera, or sundew. It's covered in tiny, sticky tentacles that look like they're dripping with morning dew. But that dew is actually a superglue that traps flies. Once an insect is stuck, the leaf slowly curls up like a fist, suffocating the prey and absorbing it. It's a gruesome, slow-motion horror movie happening in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. What really baffles biologists, though, isn't just that these things exist, it's how they got there. For a long time, the Lost World theory suggested that these species were survivors from the time of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent. The idea was that when the land split apart, these creatures were marooned on the mountaintops like sailors on a sinking ship. But recent DNA testing has thrown a wrench in that gear. It turns out some of these species are actually younger than the mountains themselves. This means that somehow, over millions of years, life climbed the impossible walls. Maybe a bird dropped a seed. Maybe a frog's egg was stuck to a dragonfly's wing during a freak storm. However they arrived, once they were up there, they stopped changing in the ways the rest of the world did. There are relict species on the Tepuis that look almost exactly like fossils from the Mesozoic era. While the rest of the world was busy inventing mammals and flowering trees, the life on the Tepuis just kept doing what it had always done. It's a fragile existence. Because these ecosystems are so specialized, they are incredibly sensitive. If the temperature on the summit rises by even a few degrees, the mist that provides all the moisture might disappear. If that happens, the pitcher plants dry up, the pebble toads lose their damp hiding spots, and 1 billion years of evolutionary history vanishes in a generation. Walking across a Tepuis summit is like walking through a laboratory where the scientist left the room 100 million years ago and forgot to turn off the lights. Everything is living, breathing proof that life doesn't need a lot to survive, it just needs to be left alone. Darwin would have lost his mind up here. Why, let's get into more science. The spirit of the stone. To the scientists, these are geological anomalies. To the Piman people, the indigenous guardians of the Gran Sabana, they are Tepuis, which literally translates to House of the Gods. For centuries, while Western explorers were busy looking for gold or fame, the Piman were looking up with a mixture of reverence and genuine fear. You didn't just climb a tepuis for fun. You didn't go up there to plant a flag. In fact, for most of history, the Pimon refused to even set foot on the summits. To them, the logic isn't in the rocks. It's in the spirits, or mavari, that live within them. They believed that if you disturbed the silence of the high plateaus, the mountain would retaliate. It would summon the clouds of the ancients to swallow you whole, or it would send down a torrent of water to wash your village away. And looking at the sheer walls of Mount Roraima or Aoyan Tepuis, can you really blame them? There is a famous Pimon legend about the Tree of Life. The story goes that once a massive tree grew so tall it touched the heavens, and it bore every fruit, vegetable, and grain imaginable. But a greedy being cut the tree down, and when it fell, the stump remained. That stump became Roraima. The blood of the tree became the waterfalls, and the scattered branches became the smaller tepuis dotting the horizon. It's a beautiful metaphor, but it also hints at a deep understanding of the landscape. The Pimon recognized that these mountains were different from the rest of the earth. They saw them as remnants of a golden age, a time when the world was whole and abundant. This spiritual connection created a natural form of conservation long before the word ecology existed. Because the mountains were sacred, they were left untouched. There was no hunting on the summits, no gathering of rare plants, and no pollution. The Pimon acted as the gatekeepers to a world they believed humans weren't meant to inhabit. Even today, when you hire a Pimon guide to trek across the savanna, there is a distinct shift in their energy as you approach the base of the cliffs. They speak in lower tones. They watch the clouds with an intensity that borders on the psychic. They aren't just looking for rain, they are checking the mood of the mountain. The mystery of the Tepuis isn't just about quartzite and frogs. It's about the human reaction to the impossible. We see something so grand and so unmovable that we have to assign it a soul just to make sense of it. The Pimon didn't need a lab to tell them the mountains were ancient. They felt it in their bones. They knew that when you stand in the shadow of a 2-billion-year-old monolith, you aren't the master of the world. You're just a guest passing through. The science tells us the mountains are dead stone. The Pimon tell us the mountains are watching. Somewhere in between those two ideas lies the truth of why these places feel so heavy with secrets. Science calls it geology. The Pimon call it home, crystal caves. For a long time, we thought the secrets of the Tepuis were all on top. We focused on the flat summits and the weird frogs, assuming the mountains themselves were just solid, stubborn blocks of stone. But in the last couple of decades, explorers found something that turned the logic of these mountains upside down, literally. It turns out the Tepuis are hollow, or at least they are shot through with miles of tunnels that shouldn't exist. Welcome to the world of quartzite caves. If you ask a geologist about caves, they'll usually talk to you about limestone. Limestone is soft. It dissolves in acidic water like a sugar cube in tea. That's how the great caverns of the world are made. But quartzite? As we've already established, quartzite is one of the hardest, most chemically resistant materials on Earth. It's the last thing that should have holes in it. Yet, inside Mount Roraima and Chimanta, explorers stumbled into the Muchimuk and Cueva Ojos de Cristal, Cave of the Crystal Eyes. These aren't just little cracks. They are massive, multi-mile systems of tunnels, some wide enough to fly a small plane through. The mystery here is a howdunit. How does water carve a tunnel through a rock that is basically armor-plated? The answer is terrifyingly slow. It's called arenization. Over millions of years, far longer than it takes to make a limestone cave, the silica glue that holds the sand grains together starts to weaken. It doesn't dissolve so much as it just lets go. The rock turns back into sand, grain by painful grain. The water then carries that sand away, leaving behind a void. It's like the mountain is slowly bleeding its own bones out into the rivers below. Walking into these caves is like stepping into a giant's ribcage. The walls aren't the muddy brown of typical caves, they are shimmering pinks, whites, and deep purples. Because the rock is so pure, the formations inside look like alien sculptures. You won't find the usual stalactites here. Instead, you find speleothems made of opal and silica that look like broccoli or long, thin carrots hanging from the ceiling. Some of these formations take hundreds of thousands of years just to grow an inch. In the dark, silent belly of the Tepuis, time moves at the speed of a cooling star. But the real Defy logic moment happened when biologists went inside. They found life in the total darkness, completely new species of bacteria and sightless insects that have been separated from the surface for millions of years. These microbes don't eat sunlight or plants, they eat the minerals in the rock itself. They are chemolithotrophs, living off the very mountain that houses them. Think about the scale of that. You have a mountain that is 2 billion years old, with a cave inside it that took 30 million years to form, containing bacteria that have been eating the stone since before humans walked upright. It's a nested doll of ancient mysteries. The discovery of these caves changed everything we knew about the Tepuis. It proved that these mountains aren't just static monuments. They are dynamic. They are being hollowed out from the inside. They are porous. While the top of the mountain is fighting the wind and the rain, the inside is losing a silent battle against the slow, steady drip of water. It also solved a minor mystery. Where does all that rain go? When the massive storms hit the summits, the water doesn't just run off the edges. A huge portion of it swallowed by stumps, giant holes in the rock, and channeled through this subterranean labyrinth. The Tepuis aren't just islands in the sky. They are giant stone sponges, soaking up the sky and filtering it through miles of pink crystal before spitting it out as the cleanest waterfalls on the planet. Exploring these caves is incredibly dangerous. The rock can be brittle. The tunnels can flood in seconds during a storm. And if you get lost, there is no GPS that can find you through 1,000 feet of solid quartzite. But for the scientists who brave them, the caves are the ultimate prize. They are the veins of the Earth's oldest mountains, and they hold the DNA of a world we thought was long gone. The real secrets aren't on the summits, they're in the veins. So how do we solve a mystery that's 2 billion years in the making? Solving the puzzle. For a long time, the Tepuis were treated like geological accidents, weird outliers that shouldn't exist. But as we've mapped them with satellites and crawled through their crystal guts, the logic has finally started to click into place. The puzzle isn't solved by looking at what the mountains are, but by looking at what they refused to be. The big breakthrough came when we stopped looking at the Tepuis as individual mountains and started looking at them as the last survivors of a great attrition. Imagine a massive, solid block of sandstone the size of Western Europe. That was the Roraima supergroup 1.8 billion years ago. It wasn't a mountain range, it was a high, flat plain. But Earth is a restless place. Over eons, the continent of South America began to drift, crack, and warp. The solution to the mystery of their shape is actually quite simple, yet mind-blowing in its scale. It's all about the cracks. As the Earth's crust shifted, this massive slab of quartzite didn't bend. It snapped. It developed a grid of vertical fractures, like a giant sheet of glass that someone hit with a hammer. Once those cracks were there, the tropical weather did the rest. Rainwater poured into the fractures, widening them inch by inch over millions of years. The softest parts of the rock washed away first, creating deep canyons. Eventually, those canyons became so wide that the blocks in between them were left standing alone. This is the aha moment. The Tepuis didn't grow. The world around them simply eroded downward, leaving these pillars behind because they happen to be the densest, most flawless parts of the original rock. They are the knots in the wood of the world that the saw couldn't cut through. But modern tech has added a final surprising twist to the solution. High-resolution mapping has shown that the Tepuis are actually breathing. Not literally, of course, but they are chemically active in a way we never suspected. We used to think quartzite was inert dead stone. But we've discovered that at the microscopic level, the rock is being broken down by specialized bacteria that eat the silica. This means the mountains aren't just being weathered by the wind, they are being dissolved from the inside out by life itself. It's a biological-geological partnership. The bacteria create the caves channel the water, and the water carves the cliffs. The very life forms that call the Tepuis home are the ones slowly dismantling the house. Solving the puzzle also meant admitting that the lost world isn't a myth. It's a reality of timing. The reason the pebble toad and the pitcher plants are there isn't because they were left behind when the dinosaurs died. It's because the Tepuis created a Goldilocks zone of stability. While the Amazon rainforest below was growing, shrinking, and changing with the ice ages, the tops of the Tepuis stayed cool, misty, and consistent. They are the ultimate safe houses. The mystery of their survival is simply a testament to the power of being incredibly boring, incredibly hard, and incredibly high up. In a world that is constantly reinventing itself, the Tepuis survived by being the one thing the Earth couldn't recycle. They aren't defying logic. They are operating on a different clock, one where 1,000,000 years is just a second and 1,000,000,000 years is a long afternoon. We now know how they formed, why they stay standing, and what lives in their hidden rooms. The logic is no longer missing. It's just written in a language of stone and deep time that took us a few centuries to learn how to read. The Tepuis are the Earth's memory, a physical record of the very beginning of life on this planet, preserved in pink crystal and guarded by clouds. The answer was hiding in the sand all along. The eternal reach. Now that we have the blueprints, is the magic gone? Not even close. We can explain the quartzite, the arenization, and the pebble toads. But knowing how a trick is done doesn't make the performance any less breathtaking. The Tepuis remain the most honest places on Earth. They don't pretend to be hospitable, and they don't change to suit our needs. They just are. But there is a new mystery now, and it's one we are responsible for. How much longer can these islands in the sky hold out? Climate change is the one predator these mountains never prepared for. The Tepuis rely on a very specific crown of clouds, a moisture cap that feeds the pitcher plants and keeps the pebble toads damp. As the world warms, those clouds are lifting higher. If the mist rises above the summits, the islands will dry out. The specialized life that survived 2 billion years of chaos could be snuffed out by a few decades of human heat. We call them the lost world, but the truth is, we are the ones who were lost. We spent centuries looking at these mountains as alien fortresses, but they are actually our most ancient ancestors. They are the original crust of our home, the silent witnesses to every breath the Earth has ever taken. The mystery is solved, but the wonder? That's eternal. If you enjoyed this journey through the islands in the sky, consider subscribing for more deep dives into our planet's greatest mysteries.